Paul, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. What we're going to look into is the role of digital evidence in cybercriminal profiling. And what I will try to do is to explain how profiling in the cyber context has evolved beyond the traditional psychological profiling or the criminological models that already exist. Nowadays, we're dealing with offenders who operate anonymously. They operate across borders, and these are things that we know for years now. No physical presence is needed. But this presents unique challenges in during digital investigation or during an investigation of an incident in general. We have no interviews, no crime scenes, no eyewitnesses, and the only thing that we truly see is the digital traces. So what we're going to look into this talk is how we can build the case of treating digital evidence as behavioral evidence at the same time. The talk is broken down into 6 sections. And even though I'm going to make the introduction and look into how the literature operates in certain areas, I'm going to focus on some recent work that I completed with one of my students, and it's about how to develop a profiling framework for hacktivism. And we'll see why this is useful, why this is unique, and how did we approach it, and what the contribution of that is. Before I start, I'd like to say a few things about me. So thank you, Nathan, about doing the introduction. I just wanted to say that my main research area is digital forensics. I'm also looking into other things. I very much enjoy looking into cybercrimes, given the link of cybercrimes to digital forensics as well. One of my latest additions is looking into digital forensics in the IoT, and also how do we use digital forensics for incident response. I'm also the editor-in-chief for Information Security Journal. So if anyone wishes to submit any research work there, you'd be welcome to do so. I also have several other interests in organizing conferences, and I'm one of the main organizers for Security B-Sides Athens that we've been doing for 10 years now in Greece. This is a little bit just of a background about me. But now let's go back into why cybercriminal profiling matters. This is an ongoing work that I've been doing in small segments for a very long time now. And I've been looking into several different types of crimes and how can we learn from them, and how can we understand better what makes each type of crime unique and what we can learn about the offender. Now, over the years, things change, technology changes, the techniques change as well, and everything transforms. Profiling supports the anticipation, not just the attribution. It's about becoming predictive about what we may be able to see or what we could identify. The idea about that the idea started when we identified that cybercrime becomes more sophisticated. There's more sophisticated type of attacks. These have become more intense, complicated in terms of the technology that is being used. There's more time needed for the forensic analysis to be completed. And essentially, there was very little work on formal methodologies about how we can learn about the cybercriminal. This was the main idea that started many years ago. This transforms now, though, as well, because Cybercriminal profiling these days is important for several reasons. It supports the understanding of the type of the actor, and also not only about identifying an individual during the investigation. The profiling also assists the operational decision making. We can analyze the intent of the offender, the capabilities that they've got, and also, quite likely, how do they escalate the paths? How do they escalate the attack or the techniques that they use? Third, profiling also informs us about how we can prevent. How can we understand the behavioral patterns and the pathways into the cybercrime, and how we can prevent some specific actions in the future? What do we need to work around in order to have a more structured and deeper defense system? However, the traditional profiling frameworks mostly relied on personality traits, on the physical world, on similar type of physical world offenses, the behaviors that they had, and there's a slightly misaligned transition into the cyber world. It is important to understand the motivation and the intent of the threat actor or the offender. We can, in such a way, we can also guide incident response and threat anticipation in a more structured way. We can also have specific technical indicators that can align with human factors. What do we learn about the motives, the skills, the behaviors of how the offenders operate? The digital investigator will also have a better understanding about the intent and the capability of the offender. It can allow us to have perhaps a faster trial system. We can have better defensive decisions about what we're going to proceed with, what are we going to, how we're going to work around it. However, this is a very challenging area for the reasons that I already mentioned earlier. We're looking into how offenders act anonymously, remotely. We have nothing tangible, nothing that we can essentially say that this is how we can understand, this is how we can approach them in the majority of the situations. We need to focus on specific elements that we have available. Now, this is where digital evidence becomes useful, because it will allow us to profile, it can allow us to profile the offender based on what we have available and based on what we can identify from what they leave behind. It's useful to always have in mind one of the principles in forensic science, that in contact between two items, there's always going to be a trace left behind. And this is something that applies in the digital world and applies nowadays quite significantly as well. Through profiling, we seek to understand, in general terms, the motivation of the actor, their behavior, the capabilities that they've got, and also how do they take their decisions? What are the patterns across the incidents that we identify and those that apply around us? This is where the digital evidence can be used, and it's very valuable as a profiling asset. Digital evidence is behavior, and it can also encode decisions, workflows, and the intent of the offender. It is a technical resource. Someone might argue, oh, but it is a technical resource. It is the evidence that is being left behind. It's the digital trace for instant reconstruction. It is also a behavioral signal. It is generally considered to be a psychological marker as well about what the motivation is and how they work. In modern profiling research, it is the only domain where the human layer of the cyber activity can be reliably reconstructed. Because everything else is not something that we can essentially touch. We have the digital artifacts that allow us to understand how the offender operates, not just what happened, but from what we identify through the digital evidence, how can we understand what they essentially, what the aim essentially was. We have traditional psychological profiling models that come into the play area, and they look into how, and we need to understand how we use these from our perspective in order to have more structured and behavioral based models that can be constructed. Many cybercriminals express their motive through the footprints that they leave. And this is a case for the hacktivism as well that we're going to look later on today. We can understand what they decide to leave behind, what are the tools that they use, why they decided to use specific tools, what skills do they have from the tools that they used. For example, how sophisticated a piece of malware might be from what they created. In a sense, digital evidence captures what they wanted to do and what they actually did, what enabled them. And this can be mapped into a behavior map and into a behavior pattern. The aim here, the main aim is that we have some pieces of evidence that can be reproduced. And this is one of the main areas that using digital forensics into profiling is also very useful, because it can be reproduced if the same method is being followed by two different investigators. There is no bias because it is grounded into the forensic principles, and there's no speculation. So for these purposes, this will be evidence that can stand in a court of law as well. We also look into what are the techniques that are being followed, what we can understand through the behavior, what do we see as the attribution of the evidence overall, which is one of the hardest problems in cybersecurity in general. So we need to have some empirical anchors to ground the whole process of that. Now, looking into the more generalized idea, we need to look into what has already happened in the literature, and there's quite a lot of work that is being done. I've highlighted here the 10 most useful and quite recent pieces of research that stand as the foundation for using digital evidence in profiling. Now, looking into that, they come from different perspectives as well. We can see them being technical, interpreting artifacts as the evidence of capability, what are the tools, the scripts, the behavior of the offender, but also how do attacks unfold. They show that the digital traces encode very much of a procedural knowledge. Looking into the same element from a psychological perspective, though, the studies can expand into profiling by linking the digital actions to the human factors, such as the motivation, as we said, the decision-making, the identity of the offender as well. one of the pieces of work that I find quite interesting and influential is from Martino, who is looking into how the online behavior can reveal the psychology of the offender. There's quite a lot of work, quite a lot of discussion here, but I also want to, I don't want to expand too much into the literature because we've got quite a few other things to see. But it's also important to keep in mind that the work of Rich integrates the digital and psychological indicators as well, looking into how hybrid models outperform the existing approaches. And this is the interesting part here. What is the evolution? How do things change? Cybercriminal profiling is not something that is new. It started in the 90s, and there is evolution in the field. From looking into the hacker psychology and what the motivation models that they've got is, over the years, we moved into a more multidimensional model that is looking into hybrid approaches and hybrid attempts. How do we merge the digital forensic artifacts with the behavioral science? Now, again, what we seek to understand is how can we use inputs such as command syntax, decisions about the infrastructure, what the practices, the timing patterns might be, how do they manipulate the artifacts? How can we understand to how we should combine the digital forensic evidence with behavioral analysis and form something that is a more of a holistic profile for the offender. Essentially, we're going from, we can split down through the findings in the literature, we can split down the behavioral pattern, the profiling areas, into 4 different groups: the technical behavior, the psychological profiling, the typology and classification, and hybrid profiling. This essentially shows us how we move from behavior profiling to technical frameworks, and now the combination of both that is looking into hybrid and multidimensional pieces of work. We are now bridging the technical parts with the forensic artifacts and the behavioral indicators into something that is more reproducible and more of an attempts to classify the attempts further. These frameworks, though, solve one piece of the puzzle. None of the existing pieces of work has essentially provided a very wide, multidimensional, evidence-grounded classification method. And looking into that, I just want to add, these last few days that I was working on this presentation, I also noticed that there's more work that has emerged over the last few months. Many researchers are looking into this field for different types of cybercrime and into from different perspectives, from different angles, and by comparing and combining different techniques and different methods that already exist. Across the literature, there's the same, let's say, research gap that remains and is being identified. The technical models essentially lack some motivational depth. The psychological models lack empirical evidence. Most of the hybrid conceptual frameworks that are out there right now look into how do we create the operation around it. But again, there's more work that needs to be done to achieve the depth that we need. We need to look into how we can create something that is more integrated, more transparent, and how we can combine the digital artifacts with the behavioral indicators and the motivational and the psychological signals in a more concrete and more diverse way. How we can create something that we can that would allow us to produce a reproducible framework. This is particularly interesting in hacktivism research because this is, generally speaking, quite fragmented, and we don't have enough empirical data that allows us to look into that. We used hacktivism as a case domain. Hacktivism is essentially the intersection of political activism and cyber intrusion. It can be approached from different perspectives, and we're going to have a brief overview of that. There's many different techniques that can be employed. There's many approaches that can be taken by hacktivists. But the main purpose here is not financial profit. The main purpose is to create noise. This is the reason why we believe that hacktivism is a good test case to look into how we can create a hybrid profile, because that can vary in the motivation, the skill, and how the behavioral patterns are drawn around it. What we looked here is how we can create a multidimensional profiling framework that will focus on the different hacktivists' sub-profiles that we will look into in a moment. Here, we essentially break down the hacktivists into three larger groups, which is very much what can be found in the literature anyway. We are looking into whether they protest for their ideology, whether they just need to have attention and they're celebrities, they want the hype, they want to end up being on the first page in the news, or whether they're focused on creating distraction on an infrastructural level for political reasons as well. In general, what we are looking here is not to define the three types of hacktivists. This is very well covered in the literature. But how we can look into the operations that they perform, how each one of them works. This will allow us to link their motivations, which are very clearly or broadly and clearly discussed in the literature, with the technical behavior. Hacktivists are quite diverse, so they are a valuable group for profiling because of the way that they work. They can be driven by their reputation, they can be driven by the attempt that they perform. But they also leave very rich digital artifacts because of the actions that they take. This can be defacements, it can be some messages that they leave behind, it can be data dumps, scripts, payloads,
Babcock was organizing networking event. Babcock.
So, unlike many other cybercriminals, they try to minimize the public exposure, but this is not the case for hacktivists. What hacktivists want to do is to broadcast their activities. They want everyone to know. They want to publish. They want to leave a footprint behind. They're also quite underrepresented in research, primarily because it is a wide, diverse area as well into looking into things and looking into different types of incidents and how we can extract enough from them. And simply because the behavior it sits in the intersection of technical execution, their signals they want to broadcast, and their actions. This is what makes it even more interesting here to look into. Now, to understand the subprofiles better, I won't go into very much detail, but looking into the ideological protest, these are the ones which motives are morally driven, essentially, and they have a digital descent. When we look into the celebrities, they are the ones that obviously show how hacktivism can turn into attention-seeking campaign. The infrastructure-focused hacktivists are those that are more sophisticated. They use different types of techniques. They can have very high technical skills. They can leave different forensic footprints behind. But what is also useful to have in mind about hacktivism is that the boundaries are often crossed between groups, between the different subprofiles. Some groups cross the boundaries. For example, Lulzsec was a good example of that. Because of the way that they decided to leak content and how they were at the same time communicating some political messages. Now, considering the idea of taking into consideration how profiling works these days, what the previous attempts in the literature have been, previous research, where we identified a gap that we would need to look into further, we decided to come up with or to work on a profiling framework that would essentially combine everything that we know. And we looked into developing a hybrid hacktivist profiling framework. This essentially aims to create an operationalization around how we understand hacktivism, an attempt to integrate digital forensic artifacts with behavioral indicators. And based on that, we identified 7 analytical dimensions for the classification, and we looked into how we can create something that is rule-based, that could be potentially reproducible, and that will offer transparency for further research. Obviously, this is a proof of concept, and it's work that needs to be developed further. But there are some interesting or useful, perhaps, areas that we looked into. To be able to examine these behaviors, we worked with 2 main data sources. We considered some forensic images that were already available from NIST. And we also looked into how we can analyze or we can expand on some public hacktivist incidents and what we can learn from these. Obviously, the trick here is that not enough information and not enough depth is provided for the existing cases. There are some artifacts that might be, or some information that is publicly available, but most of the findings are well hidden behind closed doors. Essentially, what we followed is the traditional forensic approach. We tried to extract and synthesize specific indicators that allowed us to develop a profile-specific classification rule, and these were all based on the existing literature and artifacts that we could identify from existing cases. We created a rule-based system based on the 3 different groups of the hacktivists, and also attempted to validate how accurate these results are and how reliable they can be. The digital evidence that was extracted was across several categories that are defined through the typical techniques that we follow in a digital forensic investigation. The key contributions to this work was the psychological frameworks. We specifically looked into the Big Five, the Dark Triad, and the social identity model of collective action, primarily because these were well established and for a number of years. We looked into the TTPs and we extensively used the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We also tried to bring the digital forensic standards and practices into action and see how are we going to comply essentially with what is being maintained through the practices. What is the threshold? What do we keep as a baseline? How do we need to make sure that we do follow a widely accredited digital forensic practice? And how we can be precise. We worked with different toolkits and we looked into some specialized indicators that support hacktivism incidents, such as looking into defaced website snapshots, exfiltrated data sets, and we also considered legal and ethical considerations. The idea here is that each hacktivist subtype will be using some sort of distinct TTPs, and these can be used to identify them in the future. This is where the MITRE ATT&CK framework was considered as very useful into this piece of work. Some techniques can be used from all the profiles, and it's fine because it is a good way to start identifying a group, identify the evidence sources, where any hosts, any infrastructure might be included. But it is important to look into how do we follow through the technique with the creation of the profile in mind. Now, when we looked into the analysis of the work, we essentially started with a forensic case analysis. And as I said, we extensively used the MITRE ATT&CK framework to map and match the behavior of that was identified. We looked into several different flags and specific psychological markers. This allowed us to create more of a wider integration strategy. We looked into how we can create something like a provisional matrix that will allow us to compile what is already available out there, the indicators that we have, and also to look into what are the dimensions, how we're going to look into profiling, what is going to be important for us here. Then we constructed an indicator matrix, as we called it, where we essentially look into how we combine what we extracted from the literature, the specific indicators, and specific case observed indicators. And we set some scoring that would follow each indicator of those that we have. And essentially, we came up with these 7 profiling dimensions. Each dimension is grounded in digital evidence because that is the main focus here. We looked into logs, disk images, command history, the artifacts that we could extract from the infrastructure. And by using the rule-based scoring, we tried to produce more of a transparent classification and the confidence level that we can have based on what we identified. The motivation here is the message that is left behind from the hacktivists. The tactics are mapped against the MITRE framework. Now, the organization is looking into what is the behavior? How do they organize? How do they communicate? How do they lead? We looked into the different skill levels and how sophisticated the tools that they use are, whether we're talking about customized and very specialized malware to whether we're looking into using specific frameworks that are might be available on the market. We are looking into the different channels that they use. How do they communicate? Do they use Discord? Do they leak content? How exactly do they operate? What are their patterns? What are the slogans that they've been using? And what are the cues that we have? How do we understand these? What is their strength, their operational strength? What is the moral language that they use? And that allows us to classify what we identify in a rule-based logic. Now here, the main aim is to ensure that there is transparency and the results are reproducible or can be reproduced. The framework is looking into each dimension and how each dimension contributes a weighted indicator. These were very basic, and the idea was here to identify the confidence in the results that we've got from what we identify and how we structured it all, because we want to make sure that whatever we use can be reused in the future. This scoring is essentially aims to classify how the evidence is interpretable and how we can look into that. I'm not going to go very much into detail how this is calculated, but what is important to say is that we split the confidence level into 3 areas: high confidence, moderate confidence, and low confidence, based on the results that we got through the findings that we had. Now, to understand this better, we will look briefly into how we worked around the ideological framework. in order for us to be able to say that a specific event is classified as an ideological protest incident, we need to have two dimensions that are being activated. That might be either the tactics, the organization, or the communication. And also at least one signature indicator. Do we have any slogans that are present, any symbols that are present? This will allow us to understand the motivation of the attacker and also give us an auxiliary, let's say, input that there is some political messaging that is strengthening the confidence for the findings. So we are looking into a clear motivation. We're looking into what might be out there, what type of defacements we may have. We're going to look into how they're organized. And these are indicators, the core characteristics are can already be identified or broadly discussed in the literature and make direct links into that. Then the measurement and the scoring is about what will allow us to look into how the findings can compare to what we identify from the known characteristics compared and combined with the digital evidence that we identified. So we're looking for psychometric searches. We are looking into logs, channels, how do they actually conduct the specific type of attack. That's in theory, because in practice, what we did is that we used different cases to evaluate how we approached the initial creation of the framework. And the NIST data leakage case is a hacktivist case, a simulated case actually, or a simulated data set if you prefer, that essentially contains a forensic disk image that is designed to highlight what the typical hacktivist techniques can be. And it includes and involves credential harvesting. It's got some anonymization techniques. And it also is also looking into participation in hacker communities. This is a quite straightforward case, but what we wanted to see is how our initial hypothesis or our initial development of a framework, how can that be applied into something that demonstrates or replicates or simulates the actual an actual event here. And that gave us a high final confidence of 0.8 for an ideological protest hacktivist, and which essentially allows us to claim that it is quite accurate because we understand what this case involved. We ran similar cases. We ran the framework into different examples, and this is just a brief overview to look into how it could work with different cases. It's difficult to identify specific hacktivist data sets, and this is one of the main limitations of this work. And this is one of the things that we we want to look into further and expand. And however, this experimentation, the evaluation that we run, allows us to look into the core findings and understand how the evidence can support the distinctions that were made by the hybrid profiling framework. There is a clear separation between the three different actor profiles. We can understand that, we can look into that. We can also understand from the findings that the ideological behavior is strongly motivation heavy because it is about the ideology, and the findings can be compared and contrasted with that. And also that those threat actors that are media focused, they emphasize on visibility. We have the infrastructure focused actors as well that also have, as we said, the strongest technical skills. But what is important is to see that across all the different cases that we looked, the digital artifacts reliably revealed those behavioral patterns that we had identified through the literature. The logs, the payloads that were available, the techniques that were used shows or indicates that even without any psychological interviews, we can identify the motivation, the operational style, and the signatures that were purely identified through the digital evidence. So essentially, the results demonstrate some sort of consistency of what we initially claimed to be doing. I'm cautious about time, but I'll just have a couple more slides. Now, how is this work useful? What do we learn? The contribution here is small, but it is quite clear. We can demonstrate that the digital evidence that is the core of the forensic investigation that will already be part of a larger investigation, if you wish, or be the main focus in a digital forensic investigation, can function also as behavioral evidence for profiling. It can demonstrate that evidence can be grounded into the behavioral profiling in cybercrime, and we can look into how these all can be bridged together. Essentially, we aim to move the field forward a little bit to a more integrated and more scientifically grounded profiling methodology, slowly, and hacktivism is just a simple example of that. In order to be able to take this forward, there's quite a long way to go, and a number of different research directions that we need to consider. These can be, first of all, we need more empirical data sets so we can experiment more and we can apply and we can learn. The next big step that can be taken here is to involve machine learning and create more automated systems and techniques that will automate the evidence extraction essentially and develop tools that automatically extract behavioral indicators, perhaps from logs or from file system artifacts. Generally speaking, cybercriminal profiling requires moving beyond the psychological theory of the technical signature, the technical signatures that we have. Digital evidence can be behavioral evidence at the same time, and the hybrid models allow this to emerge. One practical way to approach this is to make this approach more operational and embedded into the broader process. Because at the end of the day, I love this quote, so I just wanted to add it into the presentation, that amateurs hack systems while professionals hack people. So understanding the behavior is very important about understanding how we can combine what we know, what we can see, with what we understand about people. And that's all from me. I hope you find it useful. And